Okay, welcome everybody. We are so happy to have you here and welcome to our audience online. Actors, singers, and celebrity cultures across the centuries. We are in for 3 days of fascinating conversations about this topic, and we actually managed to cover the centuries. We start in the 18th century and we end in our day, so that is a very big slice of history of celebrity. This conference is organized by the Theatrical Voice Research Center, which has now reached 100 members, so we are really pleased with that, and membership is free. And gives access to sources, which you are all very welcome to contribute to, and allows you also to share your work on the platform, so please feel free to become a member. Before I leave the floor to Emanuela Roth for some explanation about how we run the Q&A sessions, some thanks are in order. First of all, the wonderful members of the conference committee, without whom I could not have organized this conference: Niccolò Palazzetti, Claire Civiter, Jed Vance, and Emanuela Roth. A heartfelt thank you to the Royal Musical Association and the University of Surrey for supporting this event. We are today able to broadcast this event thanks to our fantastic engineers, John Warburton and Sam Sarjudin. I apologize, Sam, if I'm mispronouncing your surname, but yeah, that I was instructed to pronounce it that way. Finally, in the unlikely event of an emergency of every kind, the exit you should use are both the door from which you entered and the door on my right-hand side. And I intentionally kept this really brief, so I'm going to pass the microphone to Emanuela now. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, as well, for all the work you've done in bringing us all here. So given that this conference is about voice, we thought it would be important to reflect on our own voices during the conference. So if we could all just be aware of, how much space we occupy. We've printed a little paragraph at the start of the conference proceedings, and I'm just going to read it out just so we're all aware. But so to help with the running of the day, we're going to make use of Eve Tuck's Indigenous feminist approach to facilitating academic questions and answers. So Tuck recommends a 5-minute break between the presentations and the question period. And during this break, she recommends that the audience discusses the presentations and asks any questions they may wish to ask amongst themselves, partly as a way of having time to think and peer reviewing questions to ensure they are framed supportively. So throughout the conference, as I mentioned already, we ask everyone to be aware of how much space they take up in the conversations, so as it would be great to hear from as many of you as possible. Thank you.
Is that working? No, I've unmuted it. Right, okay. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Emanuela. Welcome, my name is Claire Rowden. I have the pleasure to, oh yes, it's really working now. I have the pleasure to chair this first session on singer celebrities and national operatic cultures. I will give very brief introductions for the speakers today. They are in your programme, so if you want the full version, please do turn to the back of your programme. So our first speaker is Katherine Hambridge. Katherine is Associate Professor in Musicology at Durham University. She specialises in French and German musical life from about 1800 to 1850, particularly music and politics, music theatre, song and singers, the issues of genre, performance and cultural value. And now I'm going to do a little plug for her forthcoming book, Performing Politics, Music and the Berlin Stage, circa 1800, will appear with the University of Chicago Press next year. So, Katherine, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to check that I am, yes, I am fully functional. That's good. Okay, today, rather than a particularly focused paper, I'm introducing a project, a few case studies, and a methodology, or rather a methodological question that I hope that you will help me with. This is a project that I am preparing for a grant bid, and I'm unashamedly using this opportunity to get some feedback as I formulate how I want to go about that. And in this project, I trace the changing ideas and language about the German operatic voice and its others through 19th century discourse about singers. Now, my claim is ultimately that the identity of German opera first crystallized around the bodies and voices of particular singers, and predominantly female singers, allowing me to reincorporate women into the narrative of German opera's invention in the 19th century, which is usually told through composers and their works, and critics to some extent. Now, in the popular imaginary, opera is often associated with Italy, and yet just as often visually stereotyped by an unmistakably German icon. I was amused, surprised to find in this 1990s computer game the singer Fatus Singus Irritatus, for example. That the German operatic tradition was symbolized by an armored woman predates her appearance in Wagner. And one way to describe my project would be as the backstory to the operatic icon of the armored woman, or the fat lady singing, or rather, I'm going to claim that transgressive gender performances were central to German operatic nationhood. At the same time as militarism, nationalism, and capitalism were fueling the assertion of binary approaches to gender, these women singers attained their status for the nation, partly through the transgression of gender binaries. To be clear, I'm not equating transgressive gender performance with any particular body shape, but I am looking at the way they were related in 19th century discourse, particularly in relation to a kind of androgynous monumentality. And I'm also examining other forms of non-conforming gender performance, such as cross-dressing. My singer case studies are therefore among the few women operating on a public stage who performed the idealized version of exceptional androgynous womanhood we see in national symbols such as Britannia and Germania. In Monuments and Maidens, Marina Warner argued that women were more powerful symbols of the state, whether allegories of justice or of nation states, precisely because of their exclusion from public life. The power of their symbolism increased with their distance from the everyday. They didn't sully their function as symbols by actually having a function in the context of the state's operation. But the specific context of opera is, of course, one in which women were centrally functional as well as symbolic. And in addition, opera brings its own history of aestheticized approaches to gender. Indeed, androgeneity was a long-established aesthetic ideal. In this way, the androgynous soprano of the 19th century could be seen as a successor to the castrato, more acceptable to the binary gender divides that were increasingly asserted from the end of the 18th century onwards. But in opera and German operatic discourse, I think it's fulfilling a particular function too. So for German writers in the 19th century trying to define a distinctively German tradition against a still dominant Italian one, it allows them to make some important rhetorical twists and turns. And to summarize this in quite formulaic terms, you're probably familiar with the idea of the twin styles as a discursive framework in the 19th century. Now, effeminacy had been attributed by some German writers to Italian music since the mid-18th century. Above all to elite opera, above all to the castrato, leading to a common association between vocality itself, Italy, and effeminacy. The gendered, devalorizing rhetoric surrounding Italian opera contributed to the establishment of masculine instrumental music as the German national musical product par excellence in the 19th century, as exemplified by the model of the twin styles. Beethoven versus Rossini, German versus Italian, masculine versus feminine, harmony and/or counterpoint versus melody, profundity versus fashion or empty virtuosity. Notably, this model of overlapping binary divides involved the rhetorical subsumption of the French, and the overlapping binaries created a particularly problematic ground for establishing a German national category in the field of opera, both in theory and practice, with melody and vocality itself associated with Italianness and effeminacy, and the world of opera in German lands dominated by French and Italian composers, genres, and Italian performers and singing teachers. The very art and act of singing required rhetorical transformation in German discourse for the category of German opera to succeed. So this is the problem that I think my androgynous sopranos helped to solve by bridging the gender binary. And I'll return to the problematic question of their agency in this matter towards the end. But for now, I'm going to introduce Paulina Anna Milde-Hauptmann. So she attained prominence first in Vienna, and then went on to serve for several years in the Berlin court opera institution. So two very prominent positions, but from there she also toured extensively in German lands, which also gives us this, this body of discourse and reportage in journals at the time, which is a very rich source. In terms of roles, I've given you a little selection, and I've divided them up in a very self-serving fashion here, just so you can see how I'm mapping out how her roles relate to her persona as a singer. So she toured in cross-dressed tenor roles, sung at soprano pitch. So she chose to do that. She particularly liked Tamino and the role of Sargine in Ferdinando Per's opera. She also performed, not so extensively because they weren't such popular operas, in roles that were written for castrati, so 3 there that premiered in Vienna. She also performed in roles where she played a woman who was often armoured or temporarily cross-dressed. So Zacharias Werner's Wanda is kind of an Amazonian role, Reichardt's Bradamante, which was written for her, and she premiered all 3 versions of Beethoven's Fidelio. So this is how she is best known as the creator of Fidelio. She also was famous in French operatic roles, which I classify as transgressing the bounds of bourgeois femininity. Faniska, Medea, which is quite transgressive, really, the High Priestess and Statira in Spontini operas, and then a series of Gluckian heroines, although she played Clytemnestra in Iphigenia and Aulis. At the same time as she is playing these noble, queenly roles, she also was celebrated for a particular kind of rustic simplicity and natural femininity. So Weigel's smash hit Die Schweizer Familie, in which she plays a simple Swiss maiden, was written for her. She then also became celebrated in his successor opera Therese im Waisenhaus. She also carried on the Alpine theme in a work written in Berlin for her Die Alpenhütte. And she's also the soprano for whom Schubert wrote Shepherd on the Rock. Okay, so this sort of Alpine theme is part of her celebrity as well. So those are her roles. The discourse I mentioned around her is very rich, and she's cast as an operatic reformer. There are actually many resonances of the sort of discourse of Gluckian reform in the way that she is presented. And I think this is part of how the French tradition is subsumed into these binaries, actually. So Haydn's biographer Griesinger said, her voice sounds as the purest metal, as is seldom the case. And since her teacher Neukomm is from the Haydn school, she gives long, strong notes without frills and overloaded ornaments. So already distancing from the Italianate tradition. In actual fact, she's really struggled to perform a lot of the melismatic and highly ornamented passages that were written into Italian opera, so she often cut them out, and this will either be celebrated or decried by the critics, depending on where they come down in this project of German operatic singing. But it's quite common to find, as for her performance of Sargine in Vienna 1808, a critic saying, well, she had to cut them out, but what remained for us was sung all the more beautifully, with such power and purity that one gladly forgot all such passages. So that's quite common. Similarly, we have no coloratura, no trills, none of all that by which otherwise the ear can be bribed, but the simplest, most soulful, one would like to say, most genuine German song of a harmonica voice, which gives the smallest note its full due. Now, this curious metaphor is absolutely part of this project. I can say more about it, but they're trying to establish a new metaphorical field for the German voice to distinguish it from the Italian, and you get all sorts of funny associations. We also have Karl Delta commenting on her performance of Armida in Berlin, where he actually suggests that she has out-Glucked Gluck. You know, if Gluck has reformed Italian opera by simplifying it, Milde Hauptmann has gone one step further and simplified Gluck, so taken out what she considered to be too much minutiae. And this is a lovely example of the special pleading here. Gluck has clearly paid too much attention to minutiae. Milde Hauptmann comes in. And notice there she is associated with Pallas Athena in his description, which I'll come back to. Similarly, you can see her being attributed a kind of German Werktreue. She doesn't ornament what the composer's written, so she remains faithful to the serious character of the work. We also have commendation of her acting style, so there is much less artificiality in her acting style, which is something I'm going to come back to. So without the affected operatic comings and goings and the distortions of the body and neck, and she doesn't come and go and stand as if an audience were present. So this idea of naturalness in acting. We also have her attention to text, so she's celebrated for proper declamation. Some actually attribute to her the solving of the problem of German recitative, which they've been worried about. And from Ignaz von Mosel, a prominent Vienna composer and critic, her powerful, expressive, deeply thought-out performance allowed her to achieve the resurrection of the simple, natural song, which alone corresponds to the true taste. And I think this is where the combination of Gluck and the Singspiel in her roles actually allow her to kind of create a new idea of what German melody is, that is both elevated by its association with Gluck, but based in the authenticity of the German Singspiel tradition. And what you find is people attributing to her a new school in that final quote. She possesses none of the methods customary here, and she constitutes, as it were, a new school. She attracts admiration by the rare clarinet-like tone of her voice. That's another example of these unusual metaphors that you find attributed to her as they try and establish what this new school is and how to define it. And there's a particularly fun moment when she's in Berlin, a typical kind of rivalry between two divas. The local singer, this is before Milde has accepted a permanent appointment there, the local singer Schmalz, who is much more trained up in an Italian school of singing. There's a kind of a competition between them established in the press, and one of the critics dramatizes this in the form of sound bites. So we have it's the battle of nature with art, but nature will be victorious. Hauptmann is nature here. Demoiselle Schmalz has her voice much more in her power, but Madame Milde has much more power in her voice. I dedicate to Schmalz my ears, Madame Milde my heart. Okay, so she is transcending the merely physical, and these are some of the binaries that have been associated with the Italian-German tradition. So her gender was a central part of this discourse as well. Her gender performance, also her physical appearance. And this partly, I think, is built up with the idea of the size of her voice. So commentary on how tall she is clearly existing in a symbiotic relationship with the idea of her voice as massive. Haydn apparently said her voice was the size of a house. She's also associated with bells and Alphorns, another interesting metaphor. But there's a lot of quite ambivalent descriptions of her gender performance. So indescribable majesty and grandeur that nevertheless never transgress the sweet lines of femininity. You can see the strain there. They're trying to recuperate a straightforward performance of femininity. We have a figure of excellent size and fullness, which is just a standard. We also have her large and imposing, a head above the other priestesses in Spontini. Then we have masculine bearing, lots of commentary on her masculinity, her high figure, and her determinedness. And you can see also that she is nearly up to the ceiling in this temple. So you can see that the imagery is somewhat hyperbolic, as well as the language. So we have tropes established around her of naturalness, of German declamation finally being solved, of her achieving drama, not just sound, and drama, not just voice. So I'm going to pass now to past this one, because I see some glances at watches going on. Yes, so to my second case study, Wilhelmina Schröder-Devrient, a much better known figure, also because of an association with the canonical composer, in this case Wagner, who I'm going to try and leave out of the equation as much as possible. So she came from, by birth and then by marriage, two acting dynasties, which inform some of the reception about her acting skills. She also had two prestigious court appointments in Vienna and in Dresden. And she was particularly famous for Fidelio, and there's a lot of imagery of her in her bare legs as Fidelio. She also toured extensively, not just around Germany, but also to Paris and London several times. And if we look at her roles, we can see some overlap. She also did Sargine, the lead male role, but she did Pamina in Die Zauberflöte. She was celebrated as a Weberian soprano. She also was celebrated as Emelina in Die Schweizer Familie. She also excelled in Gluck and Spontini and Cherubini, but she also did much more of the Italian tradition of Meyerbeer, and then three of Wagner's early roles were created for her in Rienzi, in Der Fliegende Holländer, and Tannhäuser. So I'm going to just very quickly rush through some of the ways I would think that she is continuing these tropes, which are more familiar in her reception because she's been covered more. So once again, we have Schröder-Devrient being unable to sing according to Italianate standards, but that also being celebrated, much like Milde Hauptmann. I have heard more beautiful runs and more pleasant-sounding roulades than those of Madame Schröder-Devrient, and yet I have never heard a singer that created such an effect or who could compare with the completeness of her performance. Even Pasta in her prime, that's Giuditta Pasta, did not enrapture me so completely, for there are always places where Pasta was simply Pasta. Schröder-Devrient was nothing but Norma in every moment. There is no parterre for her, no gallery, no loge, no orchestra. So again, that idea, she's not aware of the audience. She communicates the drama of the performance more completely. She's not just a voice. And that the emphasis in the rest of the quote on her as a declamatory singer, as a tragic performer. Similarly, it will never be the natural power of the tones themselves that enrapture us. It's not just her sound. And indeed, we often even see her struggle with hindrances in her technique that are not inconsequential. And yet she creates a soul for the sound, gives it a heart. So again, with Milde Hauptmann, we had the opposition of my ear versus my heart. Milde Hauptmann will have my heart. It's the same thing. And we know that Schröder-Devrient also reduced the florid passages in her arias, or sometimes omitted arias altogether, even though she did perform much more Italian repertoire. Similarly, we have her celebrated again for the art of declamatory song, this emphasis on drama, which was central to emerging ideas of what German opera was. This idea of projecting drama and unity of text and music rather than just voice. And this is emphasized by one of the negative reviews that we get from the Englishman Henry Chorley, and he sets her in this German lineage that I think Milde Hauptmann is the first example of. So such training as has been given to Schröder-Devrient's voice belonged to that false school which admits of such barbarism as the defense and admiration of nature singing. Such a woman was not Sontag, that's Henrietta Sontag, neither of later days Jenny Lind. The two had learned to sing, Madame Schröder-Devrient not. And interestingly, Schröder-Devrient also has an opposition with another German soprano, Henriette Sonntag, like Milde Hauptmann and Augusta Schmalz, where she's the German, the Sonntag is the betrayal of the Germans by being Italian. And we also have Wagner's conversion experience, where he claimed to have been converted to the or made alive to the possibilities of German opera by watching, hearing, experiencing Schröder-Devrient singing. He claimed in Fidelio, people think actually as Romeo in Bellini's Montecchi e Capuletti. But it's interesting, she had no voice at all. He's again distancing the singer from the idea that she's just a voice. Schröder-Devrient also was highlighted as a singer that transgressed gender boundaries, not just because of the cross-dressing roles that she did, but also the way that she emphasized masculinity in her performances. Wagner celebrated her, she decided that when she played Adriano in Rienzi, she was going to enter on a horse, riding cross, not side saddle as women should, but riding cross saddle. And in the Leipziger Tageblatt, they talk about her capacity to combine femininity and masculinity in the roles of Fidelio, or completely transform into the young hero in Romeo. You get a similar kind of ambivalence that we see in Milde Hauptmann's reception. The first appearance of this young performer seemed not completely appropriate to us. Her face had more heroic fullness and nobility than the tenderness and sweetness that we expected from a Euryanthe. That's in Weber. But again, it's like just the first experience. We can indeed be comfortable that she is, in fact, feminine by the end of the quote. Okay, so to conclude, those are two of my case studies. The questions that I have and that form the basis of what the research that I'm going to be doing going forward are, of course, like who are the other members of this lineage, and is gender performance and transgression indeed so defining for all of the singers that get associated with the idea of the German voice? I don't want to force them into too teleological a progression here. I wonder if the importance of gender to the idea of German operatic nationhood recedes a little bit as the rhetoric and the repertoire stabilizes. But I note, of course, that many of the famous interpreters of Brunhilde were also prominent suffragettes, for example. So there is some continuity there. I'm interested about a moment when men potentially become similarly iconic as protagonists in this story of German operatic nationhood. I'm interested in what the alto and the mezzo does in the context of the German voice. I mean, my instinct at the minute, based on the stuff I've read, is that it presents a more problematic version of androgeneity because the pitch is lower, whereas the soprano pitch acts for them as a kind of biological marker of certainty, regardless of other transgressions, and I can talk about that. But the methodological question that I'm interested in is how we access the singer's agency, if this is indeed a project of reincorporation and rehabilitation of singers, rather than critics talking about singers. And of course, part of what I'm doing is looking at singers' letters and singers' accounts of themselves, from which you get a somewhat ambivalent picture, particularly in relation to Milde Hauptmann, as to her investment in this kind of rhetoric and positioning. She actually was a massive fan of Italian opera, kept trying to sing it, and had to be dissuaded by those around her because she wasn't very good at it. Schröder-Devrient is more invested in nationhood, I'd say, both musically and politically. She participated in the 1848 revolutions. But what we have here is such an agenda-driven body of criticism. It's been described not just as a politics of listening, but a polemics of listening, which I think is helpful. That trying to find a disconnect between the singers' voices and the descriptions of them is one of the challenges. And so one of the things I'm looking at, which I can talk about more, because I see Claire getting restless, is the possibility of doing some performance-based research here, of actually using experienced singers embodied expertise and knowledge of the repertoire, to try and reassemble the repertoire written for singers. We also have scores in which we can see the amendments that these singers made. And so the possibility there of accessing their voices, of not naively saying we can reconstruct their voice, but actually trying to access that disconnect between reportage and what they were capable of. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Thank you, Katherine. Mahima, if you want to come and set up. Lots to think about. You should stand behind them. You set up first. So we're going to go straight on with our second speaker, and then the third speaker, and then we will have the discussion at the end. So write down your questions, think about them. We will have the discussion. Okay, brilliant. So, do you want to try and speak into it and check?
Is this working?
Is it on mute or not? No, it's not. A bit higher up, maybe?
Is this working?
No.
Is it? No.
Don't think so. Is it working? There's a green light.
Is that it? No.
Okay, brilliant.
Is it working?
Just about, I think. Okay. Right, so it is my great pleasure to introduce, mine's working very well, to introduce Mahima Macchione, who is a doctoral candidate in opera studies at King's College London. Her research explores the creation of the operatic industry in Milan in the 1830s and its expansion beyond Europe during the following 2 decades, with a particular focus on Italian opera in the Atlantic South America. Her first publication is forthcoming, and now big plug, in an edited collection edited by Paolo Kuhl, Barbara Gentili and myself, Opera in Transnational Contexts, Circulating Cultures, Identities and Cultures. I can't even remember the title of my own book, sorry, which is forthcoming with Routledge next year. She is also a feature writer on opera for Limelight and works for Opera Magazine. So, Mahima, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, good. So in his groundbreaking Annals of Opera, Alfred Lowenberg explained, quote, "The book is intended to be a skeleton history of opera in dates and other facts. There are no descriptions of plots, no musical analysis, no personal critical comments. The facts are to speak for themselves, and every care has been taken to verify them so that they may serve as a safe ground on which to build a real history of opera, yet to be written," end quote. The book goes on to list well over 3,000 works in chronological order of their premieres. As Benjamin Walton has noted, quote, "The picture that emerges across the book is of a vibrant and widely dispersed network of operatic activity. The more unfamiliar the location as a site of operatic performance in a given period, the more pressing and intriguing the questions become," end quote. In writing this supposed real history of Italian opera, then, a further layer of interest is added, I suggest, by the caliber of the performers involved in any given location. Giuseppe Ramonda's is one of a few companies that visited the north of Brazil in the 1840s and 50s, and of which virtually nothing is known today. Research reveals little more than a passing mention of him in music scholarship on the region. But an unexpected and intriguing source points to a story worth uncovering. An initial desktop search reveals Ramonda's name in connection with a painter, Giuseppe Leone Righini, a native of Turin. Righini is also often referred to by a French version of his name, Joseph Léon Righini, probably a product of the fact that he had been a disciple of Laurent Péchot, a Frenchman teaching at the Accademia Albertina in Turin. Nothing else about the company can be easily found. Righini is now one of the major figures within the history of art in Brazil of the period. Art auctioneers Bonhams present him in their catalogue as, quote, the foremost European artist of the 19th century to portray the Amazonian landscape, end quote. While Sotheby's explained that, quote, although not much is known about the artist, he has left tantalizing, rare topographical paintings and drawings of northern Brazil, end quote. He is, in this sense, a distinct figure within a long tradition of European visitors or explorers who depicted the tropical landscapes and society of the country during the course of the 19th century. The most renowned of which include artists such as Johann Rugendas, Jean-Baptiste Debré, Hercule Florence, Augustin Saint-Hilaire, Richard Francis Burton, and Thomas Ender, among many others. Several of Righini's paintings and lithographs remain, dating from the 1860s and 70s, and are now valued by art collectors in the genre of travelling artists. A closer look at his surviving work indeed reveals natural scenes and landscapes from the north of the country. Not very good quality there, but at least it's something. Where he was living at the time. And as art auctioneers Christie's have pointed out, they are often reminiscent of a theatre stage backdrop. In truth, Righini had arrived in Brazil in 1856 as the scenery painter of Giuseppe Ramonda's opera company. Righini was clearly a painter of some distinction, which raises all sorts of questions about the company, not least who was in it and what did they perform. A look at the few sources left to us reveal a great deal more. During the 1830s, Ramonda can be traced performing as a singer across various cities in Italy and Europe. He first arrived in Brazil in 1846, joining the company of Clemente Munhai in Salvador. In the years that followed, he can be found singing between Salvador and Rio, and seems to have developed contacts with individuals in theatre and government positions around these regions. Nearly 10 years later, in early 1855, he signed what appears to be his first contract as impresario with the theatre in São Luís, one of the northernmost port cities on the Brazilian coast. He was charged with engaging a full company to perform Italian opera in the city and was partly subsidized by the local government for this. Shortly after signing the contract, he traveled back to Italy to find and hire the company. As touched on earlier, we know that Righini was a native of Turin and had trained at the local Accademia. Some exploration in the Italian theatre press reveals that the first soprano in Ramonda's company, Adelina Rebussini, had had huge acclaim in Turin precisely around the time that Ramonda traveled to Italy and was likely to have been present in the city. The press noted that, quote, the prima donna assoluta Adele Rebussini was greatly applauded in Turin in the past season. It's likely that he heard her singing there or heard of her while in the city before signing her on, as in fact, we know he hired his first tenor in Turin. She had also been doing very well in the time leading up to that year. And it should be noted that critics would not hesitate to point out a singer's shortcomings. Negative reviews were indeed a common occurrence. Nevertheless, praises for Rebussini abounded in the press. In 1849, Teatri, Arte e Letteratura referred to her as prima donna assoluta, singing at the Gran Teatro Apollo in Rome. Later that year, singing in the Teatro Argentina in Rome, in Ricci's Chi dura vince, she is referred by them as a real gem. By 1851, the critic for La Fama explained that Ricci's Crispino e la Comare had been a huge success at the Teatro d'Angers in Turin, a result of the care taken by the impresario who had assembled a, quote, excellent company, of which Adelina Rebussini and Carlo Cambiagio were, quote, the life and soul, end quote. Cambiagio had been the original Crispino when the work first premiered the year before at the Teatro San Benedetto in Venice. The verdict was clear. Quote, the gracious Rebussini, singing artist possessing rare ingenuity, who really knows how to portray her characters, led the public to fanaticism at several points, and had the pleasure of being hugely celebrated at every aria. She really could not have sung with greater dramatic expression, finer taste, and greater flexibility of voice. In sum, with all those rare talents that make an artist both distinguished and respected. The resounding success of this superb prima donna could not have been greater. None of her pieces went by without great applause, acclaim, and shouts of brava. End quote. Her lasting success continued to generate excellent reviews. A month later, at the Sutera Theatre, also in Turin, La Fama gave her this assessment. Quote, "If La Rebussini was great in Crispino, she was a giant in Don Pasquale. What grace, what intelligence, what expression. She really caused a sensation with both her singing and her acting." End quote. Shortly after, La Fama confirmed her new engagement with the Teatro Apollo in Venice, amidst further glowing reviews. In early 1855, shortly before being signed by Ramonda, she was in one of the first productions of Pedrotti's Fiorina at the Teatro Eretenio in Vicenza. Even if Il Pirata found the music a bit disappointing, Rebussini triumphed above everyone and was immensely praised. End quote. Predicting the future, Il Pirata noted what was to come. Quote, "Trovatore is up next, and surely, as she did elsewhere, Rebussini will be applauded as a singer with a brilliant career." End quote. They proved to be right. Il Trovatore in Vicenza, quote, earned Rebussini several laurels. Having hopefully provided a sense of her standing as an artist, and before offering some further thoughts on this, I would like to turn briefly to Ramonda's first tenor, Tancredi Remorini. Remorini was also a distinguished artist. He was born to a family of Italian singers in Moscow and was the grandson of the bass baritone Luigi Zamboni, for whom Rossini had written the part of Figaro in The Barber of Seville. In the late 1840s and early 50s, he worked at the Teatro Nuovo in Naples, where opera buffa had continued to flourish. There, he sang several roles, including Carletto in the premiere of De Giosa's Don Checco. For the following 2 years, he was first tenor at the Teatro San Carlo in Naples, where he made his debut with Donizetti's Laio nell'imbarazzo. From Naples, he was signed for St. Petersburg, where he sang alongside Grisi, Viardot, Tamburini, Mario, and Lablache. By 1854, he was primo tenore assoluto at Bologna's Teatro Comunale. From there, he had engagements in multiple German cities, returning to Trieste in Italy to sing Poliuto in Donizetti's I Martiri, alongside other operas. He then headed to nearby Brescia, where he sang with the contemporary star Fanny Salvini Donatelli, the first Violetta. About a year later, he became first tenor of the opera company of the Teatro Nazionale in Turin, where we know from a letter that Ramonda heard him singing. A review of recent performances in Geneva, published in the Swiss Le Messager and republished in La Fama in September 1855, just before they departed for Brazil, read, quote, "Mr. Tancredi Remorini is an extraordinary tenor, whose voice is rich, ample, and thoroughly Italian. Great ease, a simple and natural musical expression, and a perfect knowledge of the parts he interprets are the top qualities that stand out in Mr. Remorini, leaving in us a great desire to listen to him again and great displeasure in seeing him go." Many of the performers in Ramonda's company were active in Turin around the time he was in the city, and were probably engaged there. The reason why his destination for hiring an opera company was the unlikely city of Turin remains unclear, but there are a couple of feasible possibilities. One is that Ramonda was himself a native of the city, something I've not been able to verify, and so perhaps he already had contacts there. Another possibility relates to the network of Brazilian diplomats present in Italy at the time. We know there were officials stationed in Turin who might have helped procure the company. We have evidence of this being the case with other singers for Rio de Janeiro a few years earlier. There are also another couple of intriguing points to note. Turin had become an important city during the Risorgimento, playing a leading role in Italy's cultural and political life, precisely throughout the 1850s, culminating in the city becoming the first capital of the newly formed Kingdom of Italy in 1861. Also around that time, in 1849, Il Pirata, one of the most important theatre newspapers of the period, founded in and having always operated from Milan, moved its headquarters to Turin. The reason or reasons for this move remain unclear. Adding to that, although not hugely documented, more theatre agents were starting to emerge in Turin precisely during this time, something noticed by the press in 1850. The interest in Turin isn't so much about uncovering a new centre for the opera industry in the mid-19th century, although these changes remain intriguing. Instead, I suggest that the fact that these singers seem to have been hired in Turin, alongside the fact that they had been performing in a vast network of smaller theatres, is testament to Italy's operatic culture of the period, to the artistic skill that could be found across the peninsula. These were accomplished artists performing in smaller local theatres, outside of the major houses such as La Scala in Milan, the San Carlo in Naples, although of course Rebussini had sung there for a couple of years, or La Fenice in Venice, although of course some of that was also linked to repertoire, i.e. some theatres specialized and would produce only comic opera. The careers of Rebussini and Remorini seem the perfect case study in this respect, given their ability and myriad theatres they performed in. As Daniel Snowman points out in his Social History of Opera, unlike France, for instance, which had been a more or less united country for many centuries, its, quote, political, economic, and cultural life dominated by what went on in its capital city, end quote, countries like Italy and Germany had for long been a collection of, quote, separate, independent states with no single polity or geographical region dominant, end quote. So while Rome, Naples, Venice, Milan, and other cities might have vied for operatic preeminence over time, I suggest that artistic ability was arguably more evenly and widely distributed across the country. Snowman argues that in France, instead, one had to go to Paris for high-quality opera well into the 20th century. Putting a company together had been a real challenge for Ramonda after the yellow fever epidemic that had hit Brazil in the early 1850s, and where many singers had lost their lives. In a letter sent while in Italy, he wrote, "It's extraordinarily difficult to engage artists here. Nobody wants to go to Brazil, and those who do are either no good or are asking for fabulous salaries." End quote. Deadly tropical diseases were a South American reality impresarios had to contend with. But Ramonda managed to assemble quite an extensive company, including a conductor, a costume director, a stage operator, dancers, and others. He had also acquired, quote, lavish costumes, end quote, in Paris as part of that same trip. For set and scenery, he was in the able hands of Righini, who, by contract, was commissioned to paint 12 panels, quote, to be finally executed, and which would then become property of the theatre. Once arrived in St. Louis, the company's much-awaited debut production was Donizetti's Gemma di Vergi in April 1856. The reviews across the board could not have been any different. Quote, "It was our turn now to experience the company in Gemma di Vergi, the opera with which it made its debut in our theatre, and we can say that it corresponded fully with the good opinion we had been forming of it. Mr. Rebussini, Mr. Remorini, and Mr. Giuseppe Ippolito, and in particular the first one, are, from what we can tell, singers and actors of the first rank. The company has 4 distinguished singers who would please anywhere in the world where they made themselves heard, because their merit is absolute and independent of any opinion." End quote. As for the staging, quote, "the furniture and costumes that featured in Gemma di Vergi were lavish and splendid, and do make us believe the large sum the impresario says it has cost him," end quote. After Gemma di Vergi, they performed Donizetti's L'Elisir d'Amore, Bellini's Norma, and La Sonnambula, as well as many concerts with excerpts only. They also performed a cavatina from Mercadante's Leonora a number of times, since it was a role that Mercadante had composed expressly for Rebussini in Naples. Their time in St. Louis earned Rebussini enormous praise, as well as a crown of gold and diamonds crafted by a local artist and handed to her on stage by the audience, similar to what had happened to Rosine Stoltz in Rio de Janeiro a few years earlier. Sadly, except for one copy of a libretto of L'Elisir translated into Portuguese, little remains of the company's time in St. Louis. Righini's stage paintings also didn't survive, and instead we're left only with an impression. Quote, Mr. Righini, scenographer of renown, contributed greatly to the magnificence of Gemma di Vergy with the scenes he presented, which are so perfectly executed that they seem real. From the first act, the view of the Gothic room gave us a sense of Mr. Luigi Righini's admirable skill. But the view in the last act, which featured the castle's interior, with the village in the background and the church in the distance, all illuminated by the pale moonlight, delighted us. This scene, without the slightest imperfection, of impeccable harmony in composition and colour, earned him the title of accomplished scenographer and confirmed the opinion we had formed of him from the beginning, of his fine brush and knowledge in art. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mahima. Okay. Hello, Karen. Have I seen the glass on the stage? Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Okay. Right. So our next speaker is Karen McAulay, who is a research fellow and an honorary fellow of the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. She's also a Heritage Collection Fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Edinburgh. And she's written a couple of books on the sort of Scottish musical heritage. The first, Ancient National Art, Scottish Song Collection from the Enlightenment to the Romantic Era, 2009. And more recently, this year, A Social History of Amateur Music Making and Scottish National Identity, Scotland's Printed Music, 1880 to 1951. Thank you very much, Karen. Over to you.
We have to have props. Okay, that's better. Two famous Scottish singers, Flora Woodman and Robert Wilson, were born 339 miles and 11 years apart. There's no personal connection between them, though their stories occasionally almost coincided. Their nationality was a distinctive part of their performing personas, and their Scottish identity and vocal repertoire struck a chord with people in Scotland, the UK, and the Scottish diaspora. However, their lives, 2 world wars, and emerging audiovisual technologies influenced their careers in quite striking ways. So let me outline their biographies briefly. Woodman is barely remembered today. A singing superstar in her time, she tackled Handel's Messiah, Mendelssohn's Elijah, and the hardest operatic arias in the repertoire. Often described as the Scottish soprano, her repertoire also included ballad songs published by Boosey, some contemporary repertoire such as Coleridge-Taylor's Scenes from the Song of Hiawatha and Elgar's The Spirit of England, and Scottish songs, especially for encores. This just shows you 2 months in her logbook. The astonishing documentation of her career enables us to trace her achievements. Along with several scrapbooks of press cuttings, she logged every performance, where it took place, what she sang, which encores, her fee, her accompanist, and sometimes if they were any good, along with recording sessions, royalties from ballad concerts, and most importantly, details of her concert attire. And it's the right-hand column, you can just see it down there. The scrapbooks and performance logbook were acquired by the Museum of Music History a couple of years ago. I'm indebted to Nick Roberts for sharing scans so that I could peruse them remotely, and I'm very excited that he's here with the logbook today. Woodman's parents lived at their respective family homes in Glasgow in the 1891 census. However, Flora was born in London in 1896 in a nursing home. Her mother Janie's family was connected with the Glasgow shipping industry, and Flora Woodman's father, initially a stockbroker in Glasgow, was now lodging with his married sister in London and working in the tea trade for his brother-in-law. He married someone else the year after Flora's birth. In the 1901 census, Janie, Flora and a servant lived in Fulham, with Janie using her maiden name but marked as married. Janie had independent means, so Flora presumably had a comfortable upbringing even before her mother married barrister Joseph Vere Woodman in 1903. Woodman worked for the East India Company in Calcutta until a year or two before that. In the 1911 census, Flora appeared with her mother's maiden name, but she started using Woodman's name 3 months later. He may have formally adopted her, I haven't investigated. Woodman was privately schooled in Kensington, showing early talent, singing and playing the piano, and also composing an operetta in her early teens. It doesn't survive. The only published material for which she was responsible is an arrangement of Thomas More's Hark, the Vesper Hymn is Stealing, published by Boosey in 1923. Initially taught singing by her mother, Woodman next had lessons from Evangeline Florence, an American virtuoso coloratura soprano who had moved to the UK. Florence had made recordings and was already singing at Boosey's long-established Royal Albert Hall ballad concerts. Florence's connections must have helped negotiate Woodman's 1914 debut, first at the Bechstein Hall just before her 18th birthday, and then at the Albert Hall ballad concerts. Boosey branded a number of ballads as sung by Flora Woodman. These seem appropriate for a young soloist. They're charming but not over-sophisticated. Their lyrics speak of enjoying springtime while it's there, of finding true love, of broken-hearted lovers, or not hurrying to grow up. Towards the end of the Great War, she was engaged to a captain who had been invalided out of active service after a gas attack. However, she never married, and there's no further mention of him. His name was never given. She enjoyed a busy and successful touring career. The operatic arias that I mentioned were popular amongst ambitious young soprani. Woodman presumably chose Donizetti's Mad Scene for its acrobatic and dramatic possibilities. Whilst Lucia di Lammermoor is based on a novel by Sir Walter Scott, it has been described as a most un-Scottish opera. Whilst there is no record of her having taught at the London music colleges, she sang at concerts with Guildhall's Landon Ronald, examined for a prize at the Royal Academy of Music in 1928, and was handing out prizes at Trinity College of Music the following year, so she certainly moved in those circles. For over 2 decades, Woodman performed at the Burns Night concerts at the Royal Albert Hall, promoted by the Scottish Clans Association of London. Their badge. Her final pre-war performance there was in 1938. By now approaching 42, her logbook shows a slowing down in activity. There could be various reasons for this. Her mother was over 70 and died of leukemia in June 1940. Janie's increasing frailty may have impacted her daughter's performing schedule. Moreover, Woodman might have been receiving or even wanting fewer engagements. Wikipedia alleges that her career stalled after appendicitis, but that was in 1931. Despite complications, she soon resumed touring. I don't think appendicitis was a turning point. Woodman didn't sing for the January 1939 Burns Night. As it happens, Robert Wilson did. However, he didn't become a regular fixture since war broke out in August 1939. This event was suspended, even though some concerts continued subject to amendments as to where and when they happened. Woodman sang at the first Burns concert after the war in 1946, then 2 years later in 1948. Apart from a Musical Times advert offering vocal tuition in 1953, there's no further trace of her. She died in 1981, and no announcement is traceable in the British Newspaper Archive. The popular press and websites devoted to Scottish entertainment provide ample material about Wilson. There was a lengthy article in the Scots magazine, and his son Carey Wilson wrote a chapter for a book entitled More Variety Days. I encountered Wilson's name when I was researching for my recent monograph about Scottish music publishers, in connection with the finance that he latterly injected into Kerr's Music Corporation. Wilson was one of a group of individuals who acquired the backlist and retail concern of the Glasgow publisher James S. Kerr. Wilson was born in Cambuslang near Glasgow in 1907 to a working-class family. Redundancy from an apprenticeship as a draftsman led indirectly to his pursuit of a singing career. He had already been entering singing contests and began getting tuition. Wilson was initially as much at home in oratorio as in popular entertainment. On one occasion, Wilson and Woodman were both singing in the Messiah in Edinburgh on the same day, at different venues. I told you they nearly coincided. Wilson sang in variety performances before joining the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company for a few years, singing Gilbert and Sullivan. After that, he went solo. Dapper in a kilt, Wilson's act was loved at home and by sentimental expats, reminding them of the land that they or their forebears had left behind. Wilson was married with 2 sons. In addition to his responsibility for his family, he also assisted his parents financially, driving himself on a punishing touring schedule. He felt equally responsible for the incomes of the musicians who later toured with him as the White Heather Group. Purchasing Kerr's music business was intended to provide a new income stream as Wilson's singing career began to wind down, and it also meant he could include his own highly popular songs in the firm's publishing output. But he died in 1964, not long after a serious car crash. These 2 Scottish singers' careers thus differed in various ways. First, there's the distinction of class. Woodman had a privileged upbringing in Kensington. There may have been no pressing need to have pursued a career at all had she not been talented and ambitious. By contrast, Wilson undoubtedly needed an income. Their performing environments and their musical repertoires reflect their social background. Parlour ballads were becoming old-fashioned, variety theatre was more egalitarian. Wilson's audiences would have expected a more light-hearted and contemporary genre, and even Woodman's and Wilson's professional touring activities differ. Woodman performed all over the British Isles with frequent trips to Scotland. She spent summers performing in concert parties or quartets at beach resorts, especially the Isle of Man, Blackpool and Llandudno. Newspaper reports suggest that Woodman's mother accompanied her everywhere. However, Woodman's elderly stepfather died in 1922, so one wonders perhaps whether Janey travelled with her daughter more after she was widowed. We do know that Woodman enjoyed driving, and she sometimes drove herself to gigs. She also named cruising as a leisure pursuit, but there were a few working trips abroad. Woodman travelled 4 times to Monte Carlo between 1923 and 28 for private concerts to a retired London financier's house guests. She also made a singing tour to America and Canada with her mother in 1929, but she had declined an earlier invitation to the States when she was 21 and was disinterested in moving into musical theatre or films. Her performances as Minnehaha in Hiawatha are the only references to stage performances. By contrast, Wilson made more overseas trips over a much longer period. He too succumbed to appendicitis in Canada in 1937, but he suffered lifelong after effects. Where Woodman performed at charity fundraisers and to wounded soldiers during the Great War, Wilson, unfit for military service, joined ENSA during the Second World War, entertaining the armed forces. A year after war ended, he founded the White Heather Group, soon performing to expatriate Scots worldwide. He toured North America with them for the last time in 1955, but they continued touring after he stepped back. Woodman and Wilson's Scottish identity was clearly deeply meaningful to them. Woodman made no pretense of the fact that she was born in London of Scottish parentage, but identified strongly with her Scottish background. Her scrapbooks contain a couple of sheets noting scraps of genealogical research into the McKinnons, that's their tartan, on her mother's side. They met family and friends in Scotland as well, but newspaper reports regularly referred to Woodman as a Scottish soprano with her Scottish colouring and her Scottish accent, with one journalist detecting a Highland burr in her voice. With a Glaswegian mother, this isn't possible. Woodman's agent corrected the Born in Scotland stories, but Flora would never completely change the public perception. Part of her appeal was as the Scottish soprano. Scottish audiences eagerly claimed her as one of their own, rapturously receiving her Scottish songs in Glasgow, Ayr, Edinburgh or Kilmarnock, amongst other places, whilst she owed her association with the Burns Night concerts to her Scottish background. The programmes suggest rather well-heeled audiences, as you can tell from the advertisements behind me. Just in case you're unfamiliar with Scottish culture, I better say, the poet Robert Burns lived from 1759 to 1796. His birthday on the 25th of January is commemorated commonly with a Burns Night dinner or a Burns-themed vocal concert, and that's what she was doing. What have I done? It's gone. I pressed the wrong thing. Help. Have I turned it off? Let's try pressing it again. Oh, look, I've got it back.
Is it the slide you wanted?
Yeah. Yes, that will do nicely. We'll just go back one. There we are. Perfect. Sorry about that. My thumb was too enthusiastic. Scotland was Wilson's lifelong home. Famous as the voice of Scotland, his kilt was his performing trademark, also worn on signed photographs, record sleeves, or his published song albums of 47 popular Scottish songs. Wilson had actually repackaged 2 old publications in new tartan covers, with editing and revision attributed to his mother. I spent a long time researching this, but I finally discovered from his son, Marion McClurg never arranged a Scottish song in her life. Wilson accredited material to people whom he wanted to benefit from the royalties. Unlike Wilson, Woodman's very last Albert Hall appearance was the only time she was recorded wearing a tartan sash over a, quote, white and diamond frock. Normally, she wore fabulous but non-Scottish concert attire. The most obvious difference between the two singers is that traditional Scottish songs were only part of Woodman's repertoire, whilst more modern Scottish material made up most of Robert Wilson's, particularly in his mature years. Woodman began singing Scottish songs a couple of years after her debut. Astutely, she highlighted her youth with I'm o'er young to marry yet, I'm over young to marry yet. I'm glad my heart's my ain, or the coquettish coming through the rye. She sometimes added a new Scottish song to her repertoire at the Burns Night concert, offering something the audience hadn't heard her sing before. Her Scottish songs tailed off a little after 1927, but she certainly didn't stop singing them. Now, there are significant differences in the Scottish songs that our 2 stars sang. For a start, many songs are written from a woman's or a man's viewpoint, so they're bound to be singing different material. Moreover, a singer's repertoire can be linked with a particular era. Woodman's Scottish songs were generally of the genre that Victorians described as national songs, and by contrast, Wilson used some old songs, but increasingly more of his own material or songs written with him in mind. Neither of them used so-called folk songs collected from tradition bearers. In the early 1900s, the British Board of Education produced a list of recommended songs for schools, including 32 Scotch and Highland songs, Welsh and Irish material. Stanford published these in the National Songbook in 1906 for school use, when Woodman was 10. However, she performed few of them. Her Scottish songs appear in books that either her own mother might have owned, or in others traceable in anthologies from her young adulthood, such as the Scottish Orpheus songbooks in the early 1920s. She also included a few songs from Marjorie Kennedy Fraser's popular collections. Drenched in Celtic twilight impressionism, the latter are beautiful musicianly settings of Gaelic material. They are inauthentic, but this would not have bothered Woodman or her London audiences. Woodman's blend of genre is entirely understandable, familiar to audiences of her mother's and her own age. Robert Burns's Coming Through the Rye was exceptionally popular in the late Victorian and early Edwardian era, but not in Stanford's National Songbook, presumably because randomly kissing young men alone in a rye field might have been considered inappropriate for impressionable youngsters. Now, in 1875, the novelist Helen Mathers wrote her novel Coming Through the Rye. A rye field is the setting for the main character's rendezvous. There is no connection with Robert Burns's song. Described as belonging to the sensational genre, the novel later became a silent movie, which itself was remade and re-released, incomplete, in 1923, only 5 years before Talking Movies made an appearance. In the days of silent movies, some films did have a composed overture or prologue. Professor Julie Brown has used evidence to reconstruct the prologue for Coming Through the Rye. Using Percy Granger's Shepherd's Hay, it too has no connection with Burns's song, but another common practice was for a cinema pianist or ensemble just to play appropriate music before and during a silent movie. They would have had plenty of opportunities to play Burns's song in this film, which I have watched from beginning to cut-off end. The movie includes caption slides quoting the song despite the story being unconnected with it. And again, there are numerous shots of a stile in the corner of a rye field, which must have suggested places for the tune to be played or sung. I've also seen a couple of newspaper advertisements where a soprano, not Woodman, was hired to sing the song before the performance. Surely aware of its popularity through these various ways, Woodman sang it about 200 times throughout her career. I've counted in the logbook. By contrast, in 1932, she sang a Scottish song, a setting by Elgar. The previous year, he'd set a poem, It Isn't Me, by another English-born Scotswoman called Sally Holmes. Referencing Burns's song, The Lyric, the poem was written for Country Life magazine. When Woodman performed it at the Burnsnicht concert, a newspaper column noted that one great Englishman was permitted to enter spiritually into that charmed and patriotic circle. For Sir Edward Elgar, master of the King's music, had written a song in the Scots dialect, which was to be sung by Flora Woodman. Wilson's recorded output reveals just how his repertoire differed from Woodman's. I only traced 2 of the National Songbook Scottish songs in his repertoire, the ever-popular Ye Banks and Braes and Afton Water. He certainly sang some more traditional repertoire like My Love Is Like a Red, Red Rose, and the English publishers Ascherberg published a fairly old-fashioned selection round about 1951. Wilson too drew from Kennedy Fraser's collections, but a decade younger than Woodman, he also drew on material popularised by Sir Hugh Robertson's series Songs from the Isles, published singly from 1937 onwards and as a collection in 1950. Songs like The Dashing White Sergeant, US Tramping Song and Westering Home. As Wilson's voice tired, he shifted his repertoire accordingly. His audiences relished the couthy, Scottish-flavoured variety songs which strained his voice less. By turn comedic and sentimental, many were newly composed by Robert and or his collaborators. No comparison would be complete without acknowledging technological advances made during these years. Woodman made a few well-received recordings with HMV between 1915 and 1920. Until about 1924, she benefited from publicity generated by HMV, but there were no more recordings. So one wonders, was HMV constantly on the lookout for new talent? She was only 24 in 1920, but there would have been new singers coming up all the time. There may have been some other reason no longer known to us. By 1926, her records were almost impossible to source. Today, one is accessible on King's College London's Charm website, but it's not Scottish. By contrast, Robert Wilson produced a vast number of records for various labels between 1932 and 1962, first with Parlophone, latterly with HMV. Heavy brittle shellac 78s gave way to vinyl 33 RPM records and 45 singles. Tribute albums were also made posthumously. Before and during the Second World War, he also made 15 Pathé shorts, black and white films of popular and Scottish songs. Though the record company that Wilson latterly co-founded, Thistle Records, released few of his own recordings. Broadcasting also made vast leaps during the early 20th century. Woodman performed at one of the first 4 BBC broadcasts from Macchione House in October 1922. Her logbook records simply, wireless concert, una voce, last rose, bel radio, HS home, which means I think that's the last one of that slide. Compared to about 29 of Woodman's broadcasts on the BBC Genome Index, Wilson made about 150 and was moving into TV towards the end of his career, the start of the BBC's White Heather Club, a BBC Hogmanay programme in 1957, and STV's Jig Time in 1960. When I began comparing Woodman and Wilson, I knew they lived at opposite ends of the country, moved in different circles, and performed overlapping but otherwise dissimilar repertoires. Both were hard-working performers, constantly travelling to performances, but I discovered more than I expected. Although their backgrounds differed, their Scottish nationality was a crucial part of their identity, influencing the music they chose to perform and determining the audiences that flocked to hear them. Woodman embraced the opportunities offered by early gramophone and wireless, but Wilson's broadcast and recorded output demonstrate how advances in technology enabled him to extend his reach far more widely. When Woodman sang The Old Scotch Sangs, or Wilson, The Songs of Scotland My Mother Sang to Me, they both tuned into the affection held for these songs across the Scottish diaspora. Indeed, one of the old songs they did both perform, The Scottish Emigrant's Farewell, underlines two truths recognised by any singer of this repertoire. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, and Scotland's songs are inextricably linked with national identity. Now, there we are. I've given you a few links on my final slide, and then if you wanted to contact me, there I am. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Karen. Yes, I have turned it on. So now we have 5 minutes to discuss amongst ourselves. So if you'd like to turn round, is this going to be like a student seminar? So you four discuss, and we'll have 5 minutes conversation, and then we'll come back for questions. I'm just going to take it. Ladies and gentlemen, that is your 5 minutes. So can we bring our questions back to our speakers now, please? Because that's been 5 minutes. Can I invite anybody who has a question that has been discussed within your group and who they want to, just anybody who wants to pose a question to one speaker or to several speakers, knowing that we've been talking about this idea of national identities as singers. Anybody want to kick off with something you've been discussing in your groups? Emanuela. Yes, we need the microphone, Emanuela.
Thank you so much for 3 really interesting papers. We were just talking now about, we were quite interested with the last paper about how Wilson really played into the kilt and the Scottish costuming in a way that Woodman, I'm getting the names right, aren't I?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Didn't, and we wondered whether you could tell us a bit more about why you think was it just once that she wore the tartan, but then she costuming was very important for her, but she sort of steered clear of the tartan, and we wanted to hear a bit more about why that might be.
Have you still got, you still haven't still got your mic, no?
This is all the tartan she wore.
Oh, you do have still your mic.
Sorry. There you go. It's not authentic, I made it myself, but it is her tartan. When she wore the tartan, she had a white dress and that's the only mention of tartan that I can find. I think it's because she was singing all kinds of repertoire, not just Scottish. So she certainly benefited from the Scottish, and she made sure, because she was getting this I'm the Scottish soprano thing, she sang all her Scottish songs, and everybody liked the Scottish songs because Scottish songs are universally liked. And she was singing to expats and people, a lot of Scottish people anyway, so they would have been, my homeland, my father used to sing these songs. So she was playing into what they wanted. But she didn't see herself as just a singer of Scottish songs, whereas Robert Wilson saw himself as the voice of Scotland. So he embraced the sort of Scottishness entirely. He did sing some non-Scottish things initially, but he gradually moved away from those and just concentrated on being a Scottish entertainer of Scottish material. And a lot of it was contemporary material that it wasn't high art, but it was very tuneful and very memorable. So people loved it. And I think that's it.
Okay, thank you. Other questions?
Take that off because...
Hilary.
Hi, the 2 Hillarys have bonded here. One L Hillary. This is a question for Katherine. I was really kind of struck by this idea that Trajectories omitted arias. It's kind of the exact opposite of what I've been working on all my life. And so I'm just curious, where did she omit them? And it seems really interesting because it seems very anti-Italian to omit the best parts for the singers. So I'm hoping you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Have you still got your mic, Katherine?
I still have my mic, yeah. I'm going to give a very disappointing answer because I'm just starting my research on Trajectories, and so I've only read descriptions of her omitting arias. I can't actually give the details on which ones she omitted. I agree it's very anti-Italian. It's curious to me that she performed Italian stuff so consistently through her repertoire, given that, and that she was celebrated for these roles as well. And some of that, I think, maybe is to do with the particular appeal of her cross-dressing on stage. I mean, the legs were a big part of that, but also, the fact that she was doing something different with this repertoire from the Italian singers. That's also the same with Milda Hauptmann when she's doing French or French-Italian repertoire.
So I suppose I'm particularly interested in the way they manage to embody Germanness while singing foreign repertoire, and that's how they create the idea of a German vocality before there is a German operatic repertoire. So yeah, doing the un-Italian thing, I suppose, is precisely the point for the German commentators. But I mostly highlighted people who liked it rather than the people that complained about it. With Schröder-Devrient and with Milda Hauptmann, there were people who complained about the omissions, the lack of artistry in the singing. Yeah, sorry, that's probably as much as I can muster yet. I haven't looked into which arias, which moments. Yeah.
So does that mean when she sang them outside of Germany, she did do the arias, or she didn't do the arias?
No, I don't think she did either. I think that's why Chorley, for example, is saying that in London she hasn't learned how to sing. Yeah.
So it works in Germany, but nowhere else.
Yeah, I mean, she's not only castigated when she's abroad for it. I think there is recognition of her dramatic gifts overall, but the inadequacies, as they see it, of her voice are more of a counterweight when she's abroad.
Okay, I think I have a follow-up question up here.
I'm sorry, I just came into this, so I'm not. I may be redundant in what I'm about to say or what I'm about to ask, but I was thinking while you were speaking, and I suppose this follows what you were just discussing, that I don't recall the first singer's name, but it reminded me of the whole idea of the spianato transition into the 1830s, when basically we're moving away from the Rossinismo in terms of vocality, and the well-known fact that it already exists, or at least for me well-known, or whether or not it's celebrated as such in German vocality, in the German lands, and I'm wondering. I don't know if you were speaking to this. It sounds like there is some of that. Were these women, because we know that a lot of German German sopranis, especially, became favorites of Rossini and Mercadante and Donizetti, and there were the Fanny Eckerlins and all voice types, and they were still singing. They were still singing more the canto fiorito, the florid line. However, what you're saying suggests to me anyway that this was already something that was perhaps a German idea, a German precept, a German canto spianato, which was possibly pushing its way into the Italian vocal line. Do you think that this could have been not only because of the composers, but because of the singers themselves? And do you think that there is a possibility of...
Yes, definitely. Again, at this point in my research, I'm not going to give you a very interesting answer to that, but I definitely think the singers are driving some of that change in Italy as well. I mean, I think the distinctiveness that the German critics attribute to some of these developments in German singers is, of course, a bit of a fallacy. It's not that these things aren't happening in other national traditions. The idea of the actor-singer is also an idea that you can find in Italian discourse. So it's not necessarily that comparable developments in an Italian tradition are going to be driven by the German, because, as I say, there's a slight artificiality in the discourse. But I do think they are driven by the singers, and as you point out, there is a lot of crossover and travel. There are a lot of German singers who are, partly through Vienna, entering the Italian operatic world, but who are also conversant with these German discourses and are feeding into them. So yeah, I absolutely think it is a history of crossover as well as a rhetoric of national distinctiveness.
Thank you. No, I don't need that. Thank you. Other questions? Yes. Can I ask you to pass that back?
Thank you. Thank you. I guess this could be either for Katherine or Mahima. It's kind of relevant to both of you guys. But I was thinking about this idea of language and naturalness of the voice with particular languages. And Mahima mentioned some translations of libretti into Portuguese, and I don't know if the German singers that you were discussing, Katherine, sang any German translations of potentially Italian or French libretti. So I'm just curious if either of you could say anything about how singing in these languages related to perception of sort of the vocality of the singers and their skill.
Mahima, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, sure. Right, does this work?
Yes.
Right, okay. Yeah, well, actually, yes, I did show the libretto translated into Portuguese, but they were singing in Italian, so that was just for the audience to sort of follow the storyline. Yeah, and I think the review about Remorini, where they say that his singing was very Italian, I think it's kind of a very common kind of thing to they come across in reviews of Italian singers, which you could say so much about, I guess. But yeah, they were singing in Italian. I don't know. Have I answered your question or?
Yeah, I guess I wasn't paying attention. Sorry, but the audiences wouldn't have been Italian speaking, so that was just for them. Okay, got it.
That's right. Yeah. They would translate the libretti, but it was obviously a sort of Italian company coming from abroad and was viewed as such. Yeah.
Katherine, do you want to pick that up?
I can quickly answer a little bit. Milda Hauptmann was singing pretty much everything in translation, the French and French-Italian repertoire. And in a lot of German theatres in this period, both opera buffa and sometimes even opera seria, when they were translated, the recitatives would be put into speech because of the difficulty of creating a German version of Italian or French recitative. For Tragédie lyrique as well, which is partly the significance of her declamatory talent, is the idea that she is beginning to forge a tradition of German recitative. Of course, there has been a tradition of German recitative in the sacred cantata tradition, so I'm kind of interested as to why that gets left out so much from this. But I think there is an idea that she is naturalizing recitative sung declamation, and she's naturalizing this foreign repertoire as well. I think that's part of what she's doing, and why I think it's so significant in terms of the German operatic tradition. They think, finally we kind of fully sung through opera. Yeah.
Thanks. Other questions?
I'm sorry, I can't see your. How do you pronounce your name? Our
Mahima?
second speaker.
Mahima?
Mahima. I was wondering if you knew of the Remorinis, if you've traced their career through Spain at all, or if you knew about that.
No,
particularly in Barcelona.
Barcelona, no. I mean, I had a look through the Italian press, and the bits that most of the things I came across were from there, but I'm not aware that he was in Barcelona.
Perhaps I can help, unless of course it was a generation prior, but I believe it's
the same person.
I believe it's the same ones. There were Remorini singing quite famously in Spain.
This tenor, Tancredi Remorini, you're saying it's
I believe,
the same?
but wasn't there another one on the roster as well?
Another one?
Another Remorini.
There could have been. I'm not aware of. But
were there not two, or are my eyes?
No, I was talking about one only.
Deceiving me.
Hold on. The wife, perhaps.
The wife, I believe. Yeah.
Yes.
We could speak about this. I might.
Okay, sounds good.
Be able to help.
Thank you.
If it's of consequence.
Thank you very much.
Well, if there are no other questions, I actually have a comment more than a question for Katherine. Two things. First of all, how the singers were owning their tradition, and they could do really this repertoire was really super alive. It was a thing they were building. They could sing roles in voice types that were not their voice types, and I found this a lot also in the bel canto, Rossini repertoire, so it is common, it's shared. And the other thing, I was really impressed with this declamatory style so early on in the century. I thought, according to the sources I looked at, was later happening from the mid-19th century onwards. So that is really striking. How did these singers cope? So when Devrient sang Norma, she must have done whatever she wanted of that part, because it's completely packed with coloratura, and that's the difficulty. It's a big role, it's a dramatic with this coloratura, and so what did you reconstruct? Do you have any idea about how she coped with that?
I can say one thing, and obviously this is what I'm going to be going on to research when I get to have a look at some of the annotated parts. She was well known, not just for a declamatory style of singing, but actually going into a spoken register. And so, I mean, this is not the same as cutting out ornamentation from the aria, but it feeds into this perception of a declamatory style. She was particularly famous for that line in Fidelia where you'll have to kill his wife first, and she electrified the audience by taught erst sein Weib or something, and she went into speech for Weib, and then that became part of her declamatory style, to the extent that Berlioz really complains about her when she's in Paris, constantly going into shouting rather than singing. So one of the ways she accessed a declamatory style was literally by declaiming, and she does come also through this spoken theatrical tradition, which is interesting. Milda Hauptmann did a little bit of that. Of course, it is part of the German tradition with the spoken element of Singspiel as well. So I wonder if that is partly accounts for the closer relationship early in the century. That's one answer.
You were talking about the way that the French is subsumed into the Italian, but at the same time, of course, the French, like in Germany, it's all the Italian pedagogues who then sort of get Frenchified into a slightly more declamatory style, via Gluck, and all that sort of thing. So it's sort of happening in a different way in France, but it's and again those French pedagogues who start taking the Italian treatises and Frenchifying them from about the 1830s onwards. So it's sort of happening in a similar way.
And that's why Gluck, I think, is so central for both of them. He was being rhetorically adopted as a German by critics, but I think in many ways far more significant is what's happening when these German singers sing Gluck on the stage, and then that gets used by the critics in ways that don't acknowledge actually that it's a French thing.
Okay, I just thought we'd get that back in there. Okay, I think if there are no more questions, we have come to the end of this session. First great session. Thank you very, very much. I think it's coffee time.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all our speakers, fantastic talks. And if there's no coffee outside, it is on its way. I've been reassured. Generally, they are ready ages beforehand, but are maybe slightly late today. Thank you.